The carriage arrived at dawn, before the frost had even lifted from the windows, and Evelina Marsh knew before she reached the door that something had gone terribly wrong. Her father never received visitors this early. He barely received visitors at all anymore, not since the creditors had started sending letters instead of calling in person. She pulled her shawl tight and stepped into the hallway just as the front door opened. A tall man in a gray coat stood there, holding a leather case against his chest like it held something dangerous. Behind him, a second carriage waited in the lane, its black paint gleaming even in the weak morning light. That crest on the door. She had seen it before, stitched into the corner of a newspaper article about a Duke nobody in her circle had ever met in person. "Mr. Marsh," the man said, stepping past her without so much as a glance, "I need a moment of your time. It concerns your daughter." Evelina's stomach dropped. She followed him into the study, uninvited, and nobody stopped her. Her father sat behind his desk looking smaller than she remembered, his face pale, his hands folded too tightly together. He did not meet her eyes when she entered. "Papa," she said, "what is this?" "Sit down, Evelina." She did not sit. She stood by the door, arms crossed, watching the stranger open his case and remove a folded document sealed in red wax. He set it on the desk like he was placing a loaded weapon. "My employer is the Duke of Ashcombe," the man said. "He requires a wife within the month, a woman of quiet reputation, no scandal attached to her name, no entanglements. In exchange, your father's debts will be settled in full and your family's estate will remain in your name." The room went silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. "You cannot be serious," Evelina said. "I assure you, I have never been more serious in my life." Her father finally looked up, and what she saw in his face frightened her more than anything the stranger had said. Not anger, not shame, just exhaustion, the kind that had been building for years and had finally run out of road. "They will take this house by spring," he said quietly. "I have tried everything, Evelina, everything." "So you would sell me instead?" "Nobody is selling anybody," the solicitor said, though his tone suggested he had rehearsed that line many times before. "The Duke requires a wife of respectable character. He does not require beauty connections or a large dowry. In fact, he specifically instructed me to seek out a woman who would not attract attention in society. Someone plain, someone steady. Forgive my bluntness, but those were his words." Evelina felt her face burn. Plain, steady, someone who would not attract attention. She had heard variations of that description her whole life, whispered behind fans at balls she had stopped attending 2 seasons ago, murmured by mothers steering their sons toward prettier girls in prettier dresses. She had made peace with it, or told herself she had. Hearing it spoken aloud in her father's study, calmly, as though it were a qualification rather than an insult, cut deeper than she expected. "And if I refuse?" The solicitor closed his case with a soft click. "Then your father loses this house, this land, and whatever remains of his good name. The Duke will find another bride within the week. There are many families in far worse positions than yours who would accept this offer without a moment's hesitation." She looked at her father. He did not argue. He did not defend her. He simply watched her with pleading eyes, as though he already knew what her answer would be and hated himself for needing it. "I need time to think," she said. "You have until sundown." By the time the carriage disappeared down the lane, Evelina had already walked the length of the garden 3 times, her boots soaking through from the frost, her mind racing faster than she could keep up with. She thought of her mother, gone 5 years now, and what she would have said. She thought of the tenant families on their land who depended on her father's fairness, families who would suffer far more than pride if the estate changed hands. She thought of herself in 10 years, unmarried, watching this house crumble around her while her father's name became a joke told at other people's dinner tables. And she thought of the man she had never met, a duke who wanted a wife the way other men wanted a well-made coat, something practical, something that would not embarrass him. She found her father in the study again that evening, staring at the fireplace as though it might offer him an answer. "I will do it," she said. He closed his eyes. Relief and grief moved across his face at the same time. "Evelina, I am so sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just don't ever ask me to smile about it." The wedding date was set for 6 weeks from that day. There was no courtship, no letters exchanged, no meeting arranged beforehand. The solicitor explained that the Duke was occupied with matters in the north and would arrive only days before the ceremony. Evelina told herself this suited her fine. She did not need to know the man to sign a paper binding her to him. She only needed to survive it. Her cousin Margaret came to help with the arrangements, since there was no mother left to do it, and no money left to hire the kind of seamstress a proper wedding usually required. Margaret sewed the gown herself, plain ivory silk with no lace, no embroidery, nothing that might suggest a bride excited for her own wedding. "You could smile a little," Margaret said one afternoon, pins between her lips as she adjusted the hem. "People will talk if you look this miserable at your own wedding." "People are already talking, Margaret. That is rather the entire premise of this arrangement." "Do you know anything about him, the Duke?" Evelina shook her head. "Only that he is 30, unmarried, and apparently in a great hurry to change that before some deadline concerning his inheritance. Beyond that, nothing. I do not even know the color of his eyes." "That seems like something you might want to know, given that you will be sharing a house with him for the rest of your life." "What I want and what I am getting appear to be two very different things." The weeks passed in a strange fog of fittings and legal documents and long silent dinners with her father, who could barely look at her without his eyes welling up. Evelina found herself avoiding mirrors. She did not want to see the woman starring back, the one who had agreed to marry a stranger, because the alternative was watching everyone she loved lose everything. 3 days before the wedding, the Duke arrived. Evelina watched from an upstairs window as his carriage pulled into the drive, sleek and black, drawn by 2 matched horses that probably cost more than her father's entire estate. A footman opened the door, and a man stepped out. He was younger than she expected, tall, with dark hair cut close and neat, wearing a coat so well fitted it seemed to have been sewn directly onto him. He moved with the kind of unhurried confidence that came from never once in his life worrying about money or consequence. He did not look up at the house. He did not look eager, or nervous, or curious about the woman he was about to marry. He simply walked to the front door as though attending a business meeting he had scheduled weeks in advance, which, in a sense, he had. Evelina stepped back from the window before he could see her watching. Downstairs, her father greeted him with stiff formality. Evelina waited until she was called before descending the staircase, chin lifted, refusing to let her hands shake even though her heart was pounding hard enough that she could hear it in her ears. The Duke turned as she entered the room. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not disappointment exactly, though she braced herself for it. Something closer to surprise, quickly smoothed over into careful neutrality. "Miss Marsh," he said with a slight bow, "Julian Ashcombe." "Your Grace." "There is no need for such formality between us. We are to be married in 3 days. Forgive me if I have not yet adjusted to the idea." Something almost like amusement crossed his mouth, there, and gone so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it at all. "Nor have I, if I am honest," he said. "But I find that certain arrangements, however unusual, are sometimes necessary. So I have been told, several times in fact by your solicitor. Mr. Whitfield does tend toward bluntness. I apologize if his manner was unkind." "He was not unkind, he was simply accurate." The Duke studied her for a moment longer than felt comfortable, and Evelina forced herself not to look away, not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch under his gaze. Whatever he was searching for in her face, she could not tell. He gave nothing away. "I will see you at the church, Miss Marsh," he said finally. "I imagine you will, Your Grace. I have very little choice in the matter." He did not respond to that. He only nodded once, gathered his coat, and left as quickly as he had arrived, leaving Evelina standing in the hallway with her heart still pounding, and absolutely no clearer understanding of the man she was about to marry than she had before he walked through the door. That night she sat by her window long after the candles in the rest of the house had burned out, watching the dark shape of the road where his carriage had disappeared. She tried to imagine what her life would look like in a month, in a year, married to a stranger in a house she had never seen, surrounded by people who already knew her only as the plain girl the Duke had settled for. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry over this, not once, not even alone in the dark where nobody would ever know. But she sat awake a long time, turning his words over in her mind. Certain arrangements, however unusual, are sometimes necessary. He had not sounded cold when he said it. He had sounded almost as trapped as she felt. It was a small thing to hold on to, but in the days leading up to her wedding, it was the only thing that kept her from feeling entirely alone in what was about to happen to her life. The morning of the wedding, Evelina woke before the sun and lay still in her bed for a long while, listening to the house creak around her the way it always did in the cold months, as if it too were bracing itself for change. Margaret arrived an hour later with the gown draped over her arm, her eyes red from crying the night before, though she tried to hide it behind a bright smile. "You look beautiful," Margaret said, once the gown was fastened and Evelina stood before the mirror. "I look like someone about to attend a funeral." "Do not say such things. This is your wedding day." "Is it? It feels more like the closing of a business transaction. I half expect Mr. Whitfield to appear with more papers for me to sign." Margaret laughed despite herself, though the sound cracked in the middle. She fixed a strand of hair behind Evelina's ear and held her by the shoulders, looking at her with a seriousness that surprised them both. "Whatever this marriage is," Margaret said, "you are still you inside it. Do not let anyone, not even a duke, convince you otherwise." Evelina held onto those words the entire ride to the church, repeating them silently as the carriage rattled over the frozen road. The chapel was small and mostly empty, only her father, Margaret, a handful of servants, and a scattering of the Duke's relatives she did not recognize. No crowd of well-wishers. No whispered excitement among the pews. It was, in every sense, exactly the quiet, unremarkable affair everyone had promised her it would be. Julian Ashcombe stood at the altar in a dark blue coat, his expression composed into something unreadable. When Evelina reached him, he offered his arm without a word, and together they turned to face the priest. The ceremony passed in a blur of vows spoken in careful, measured tones. Evelina heard her own voice promising things she barely understood the weight of, and heard his voice answer in kind, steady and clear, without a single tremor. When the priest pronounced them married, Julian leaned in and pressed the briefest kiss to her cheek, so quick and formal it barely qualified as a kiss at all. It was done. The small gathering that followed at the estate felt more like a business luncheon than a wedding breakfast. Julian's relatives spoke to each other in low voices, occasionally glancing her way with expressions she could not read, somewhere between curiosity and pity. One older woman, introduced as Lady Vane, studied Evelina from across the room with an intensity that made her skin prickle, though she said nothing directly. By late afternoon, the carriages were loaded, and Evelina said goodbye to her father and Margaret with a composure she did not feel inside. Her father held her hands for a long moment, tears finally slipping free. "You have saved this family," he said. "I will spend the rest of my life regretting what it cost you." "Do not regret it, Papa. Regret helps no one." She climbed into the carriage beside her new husband, and the doors closed and the horses pulled forward, and just like that, the life she had known for 22 years disappeared behind them on the frozen road. Ashcombe Hall was larger than anything Evelina had imagined, A great stone house set among wide lawns and old oak trees, its windows glowing gold against the darkening sky as the carriage approached. Rows of servants stood outside to greet them, and Evelina felt every one of their eyes assessing her, measuring her against whatever expectations they had formed about the new mistress of the house. Julian handled the introductions himself, his voice polite but distant, the same tone he had used all day. He introduced her to Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, a broad-shouldered woman with kind eyes and a firm handshake, and to a handful of others whose names blurred together in Evelina's exhausted mind. Inside, the house was grand in a way that felt almost oppressive. High ceilings and long hallways lined with portraits of ancestors who all seemed to share the same stern expression. Julian led her through the main rooms with brief, functional descriptions, pointing out the library, the drawing room, the dining hall, speaking as though he were showing a guest around rather than welcoming a wife into her new home. "Your chambers are this way," he said finally, leading her up a wide staircase to the east wing. The room he showed her was beautiful, decorated in soft blues and creams, with a large window overlooking the gardens below. It did not feel like it belonged to anyone yet. It felt, Evelina thought, exactly like her marriage. A space prepared in advance, waiting for someone to fill it with meaning that had not yet arrived. "I hope this is satisfactory," Julian said, standing awkwardly near the doorway. "It is lovely, thank you." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Evelina wondered, with a nervous twist in her stomach, what was expected of her now, on this first night as his wife. She had heard whispered things from other married women, vague warnings and vaguer reassurances, but nothing that prepared her for the reality of standing in a strange bedroom with a man she barely knew. Julian cleared his throat. "I will not intrude on your privacy tonight," he said. "You have had a long day. Rest. We can speak further in the morning." He bowed slightly and left before she could respond, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Evelina stood alone in the middle of the room for a long moment, unsure whether she felt relief or something closer to confusion. She had braced herself for so many possible outcomes of this night, and being simply left alone had not been among them. She slept poorly, waking often to unfamiliar sounds, the wind against unfamiliar windows, the creak of an unfamiliar house settling around her. By morning, she felt more tired than she had the night before, but she dressed carefully and made her way downstairs, determined not to appear as lost as she felt. She found her breakfast already laid out in the small morning room, and beside her plate, a pot of tea steeping in a particular blend she recognized immediately. Chamomile with a touch of honey, the exact combination she had mentioned once, in passing, to Margaret weeks earlier while discussing wedding preparations. She could not imagine how anyone in this house would know such a small detail about her. "Good morning." She looked up to find Julian standing in the doorway, already dressed for the day, a folded newspaper under his arm. "Good morning," she said carefully. "This tea, how did you know?" Something flickered across his face, quickly masked. "Mrs. Fenwick mentioned you had a preference. I asked the kitchen to prepare accordingly." It was a small lie, she suspected, though she could not say how she knew. Mrs. Fenwick had met her only the evening before and had no way of knowing her tea preferences. But she said nothing, only thanked him and poured herself a cup, watching him from beneath lowered lashes as he took his seat across the table and disappeared behind his newspaper. The days that followed settled into a strange, careful rhythm. Julian was rarely home during daylight hours, occupied with estate matters and meetings Evelina was not invited to attend. Their dinners together were polite and mostly silent, punctuated by brief exchanges about the weather or the household accounts, nothing that ventured near anything personal. And yet, small things kept appearing, quiet gestures that contradicted the coldness of his manner. A book she had mentioned wanting to read, left on her nightstand with no note attached. Her favorite flowers, replaced fresh in her room every few days, though she never mentioned a preference to anyone in the household staff. A warmer shawl left near the drawing room fireplace on a particularly cold evening, exactly the kind of thing she might have wished for but never voiced aloud. She began to watch him more closely during their dinners, searching his face for some explanation, some acknowledgement of these small kindnesses. He gave nothing away. He remained polite, distant, correct in every way, as though the man leaving books on her nightstand and the man sitting across from her at dinner were two entirely different people who happened to share the same house. One evening, nearly 3 weeks into her marriage, Evelina worked up the courage to ask him directly. "The books," she said as he poured himself a glass of wine. "The flowers, the shawl by the fire, was that you?" Julian's hand paused for the briefest moment before continuing its motion, smooth and unhurried. "I am not certain what you mean." "I think you are certain. I simply think you do not wish to admit it." He set down the wine and looked at her, and for the first time since their wedding day, something in his expression shifted into what looked almost like vulnerability, quickly buried beneath his usual composure. "Perhaps I wished for you to feel comfortable here," he said finally. "This house can feel cold to those unfamiliar with it. Why not simply tell me so, instead of leaving anonymous gifts like some kind of secret admirer?" "Because," he said and stopped himself, his jaw tightening slightly, "because it is easier this way." "Easier for whom?" He did not answer. He drank the rest of his wine in silence, and the conversation moved elsewhere, though Evelina found herself thinking about his words long after the meal ended. Easier this way. As though speaking plainly about kindness required more courage than the kindness itself. She began to notice other things about him in the weeks that followed. The careful way he avoided any topic that touched on emotion. The stiffness that entered his shoulders whenever a servant mentioned his family, particularly a name she had heard whispered once or twice but never explained. Charlotte. She did not know who Charlotte was, but she noticed the way conversation halted whenever the name arose, the way Julian's expression closed off entirely, like a door slamming shut. She also noticed, with a discomfort she did not examine too closely, that she had started looking forward to their dinners. Started noticing the particular way he tilted his head when considering a question, the dry humor that occasionally slipped through his careful reserve when discussing something absurd in the newspaper, the surprising gentleness in his voice when speaking to the household staff, despite his coldness toward her. It confused her. She had married a stranger, expecting nothing beyond a practical arrangement, and yet here she was, cataloging small details about him with an attention she could not quite explain away as simple curiosity. One afternoon, exploring the house while Julian attended to estate business, Evelina found herself in the East Wing, in a hallway she had not yet ventured into. A portrait hung near the end of the corridor, half hidden in shadow, depicting a young woman with dark hair and Julian's same serious eyes, smiling in a way Evelina had never once seen him smile. She stood before it for a long time, studying the resemblance, wondering who this woman was and why her portrait hung in a forgotten corner of the house, rather than proudly displayed among the family gallery downstairs. Footsteps approached behind her, and she turned to find Mrs. Fenwick standing there, her expression carefully neutral. "That is Lady Charlotte," the housekeeper said quietly. "His Grace's sister. She passed some years ago." Evelina's chest tightened with an unexpected sympathy. "I am sorry, I did not know." "His Grace does not speak of her. It is a painful subject and I would advise against raising it directly." Mrs. Fenwick paused, studying Evelina with something that looked almost like assessment. "He has been different since your arrival, if you do not mind my saying so. Quieter, perhaps, but different." "Different how?" Mrs. Fenwick only smiled faintly and moved on down the hallway, leaving the question unanswered and Evelina standing alone before the portrait of a woman she now understood carried more weight in this house than anyone had explained to her. That night at dinner, she considered raising the subject, then thought better of it, remembering the housekeeper's warning. Instead, she watched Julian across the table, seeing him now with a slightly different understanding. A man carrying grief he refused to name, hiding kindness behind anonymous gestures, retreating into cold formality rather than risk exposing whatever softness lived beneath it. She did not know yet whether this understanding would bring them closer together, or simply give her more reasons to feel shut out of the parts of him that mattered most. But she found herself, against every intention she had carried into this marriage, wanting to know the answer. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, sealed in gold wax and addressed to the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe, the first formal event Evelina would attend since her wedding. Lady Vane was hosting a gathering at her townhouse in the city, and though Evelina had hoped to avoid society for a little while longer, Julian informed her over breakfast that attendance was expected. "It would raise questions if we did not appear," he said, folding his newspaper with more care than the action required. "People are already curious about our marriage. Absence would only fuel further speculation. And appearing will not. Appearing gives us some measure of control over what they see." Evelina spent the following days preparing with a nervous energy she tried to hide, choosing a gown of deep green that Margaret had once told her suited her coloring, practicing polite conversation in the mirror, rehearsing answers to questions she suspected would come her way. She had spent years avoiding society precisely because of moments like this one, evenings designed to expose every insecurity she had ever carried about herself. The townhouse, when they arrived, glowed with candlelight and buzzed with conversation, dozens of guests moving between rooms in silks and jewels that made Evelina acutely aware of her own comparatively simple gown. Julian kept close beside her, his hand resting lightly at her back, guiding her through introductions with a steadiness she appreciated more than she let herself admit. For the first hour, things went smoothly enough. She spoke with a few of Julian's distant relatives, exchanged pleasantries with women who studied her with obvious curiosity but nothing openly unkind. She began to relax, just slightly, thinking perhaps the evening would pass without incident. Then Julian was called away by a business acquaintance, and Evelina found herself alone near the edge of the drawing room, close enough to a group of women gathered near the refreshment table to hear their conversation without meaning to. "I still cannot believe he actually married her," one woman said, her voice pitched low but not low enough. "After everything with Henry's wager, I assumed it was simply talk." Evelina's whole body went still. "What wager?" another woman asked. "You did not hear. Henry Vane wagered his cousin a considerable sum that he could not find a bride plain enough to avoid drawing attention before his birthday deadline. Something about needing a wife who would not embarrass him, who would fade into the background entirely. And here we are." The woman's voice dropped even lower, laced with something between amusement and pity. "One does wonder if Miss Marsh, forgive me, the Duchess, knows the terms under which she was selected." Evelina's ears rang. The room around her seemed to tilt slightly, the candlelight blurring at the edges of her vision. She thought of the solicitor's words in her father's study, weeks ago now. A woman who would not attract attention in society. Someone plain, someone steady. Forgive my bluntness, but those were his words. She had told herself those words came from necessity, from a duke seeking practicality rather than romance. She had not considered they might have come from a wager. A joke among wealthy men with nothing better to occupy their time, and she the punchline, selected specifically for her plainness to win a bet she knew nothing about. She did not remember walking away from the group. She found herself in a quiet hallway a few minutes later, her hand pressed against the cool wall, her breath coming faster than it should have. The portrait in the East Wing flashed through her mind unbidden, the young woman with Julian's serious eyes, and she wondered, with a bitterness that surprised her, whether that story had been carefully constructed too. Another kindness designed to keep her comfortable and compliant while he collected his winnings. "Evelina." She turned to find Julian approaching, his expression concerned, clearly having noticed her sudden absence from the drawing room. "Are you unwell? You look pale." "I am perfectly well," she said, though her voice came out sharper than intended. Something in his expression shifted, wariness replacing concern. "You do not look well." "I heard something interesting this evening," she said, unable to stop the words now that they had started. "A wager, apparently. Your cousin Henry. Something about finding a bride plain enough to win a bet before your birthday." Julian went very still. "Evelina, I can explain." "Can you? Please, do explain. I would love to hear how you intend to make a wager sound like something other than exactly what it is." "The wager existed," Julian said carefully, "but I refused it. I told Henry in front of witnesses that I would not participate in something so beneath both of us. That was months before I ever met you. How convenient that I have no way of confirming that." "Evelina, do not." She held up a hand, stepping back from him. "I do not wish to discuss this further tonight. I would like to go home." The carriage ride back to Ashcombe Hall passed in complete silence, Evelina staring fixedly out the window while Julian attempted twice to speak, each time falling silent again when she offered no response. By the time they reached the house, something inside her had hardened into a decision she did not fully examine but felt nonetheless with absolute certainty. Whatever softness had been growing between them over the past weeks, whatever curiosity she had allowed herself to feel toward this man and his careful, hidden kindnesses, she would not extend any further, not until she understood exactly what she had married into. The following morning, she did not join him for breakfast. She told Mrs. Fenwick she preferred to take her meal in her room, and the housekeeper's expression flickered with something like concern before she nodded and withdrew without questioning it. Evelina spent the day in the library instead, choosing books at random and reading without absorbing a single word, her mind circling endlessly around the conversation from the night before. Julian sought her out that evening, knocking softly at her door. "Evelina, may we speak?" "I am tired tonight," she called back, though she was sitting fully awake by the window, watching the last light fade from the gardens below. "Perhaps another time." Another time did not come easily. Days passed, then a full week, and Evelina found herself retreating further with each one, answering his questions in short, polite sentences that offered nothing beyond what was strictly necessary, avoiding the library when she knew he would be there, taking her meals separately whenever she could manage it without appearing openly hostile to the household staff. Julian, for his part, did not push. He asked once or twice if something troubled her, and when she deflected with vague answers about tiredness or headaches, he simply nodded and let the matter drop. She told herself this was proof enough of his true character, a man who would not fight to explain himself when confronted with something uncomfortable, a man perhaps relieved that she had stopped expecting more from him than the practical arrangement they had originally agreed to. She did not consider, in those weeks of careful distance, that his silence might mean something entirely different, that a man who had spent his whole life avoiding difficult conversations, who left kindness in anonymous gestures rather than spoken words, might simply not know how to fight for something he had never learned to name. The anonymous gifts stopped appearing. Evelina noticed this only gradually, the absence of fresh flowers in her room, no new books appearing on her nightstand, no small unexplained comforts left in places she might find them. She told herself this did not matter, that she had never asked for such things in the first place, that their absence changed nothing about her decision to keep her distance. But some nights, lying awake in the quiet dark of her chambers, she found herself missing them more than she wanted to admit, wondering if she had misjudged something important in her haste to protect herself from further hurt. Nearly a month into this careful, painful distance, Evelina encountered Henry Vane himself at a small dinner gathering hosted by one of Julian's business associates. He approached her directly, wine glass in hand, an easy smile on his face that made her stomach turn the moment she recognized him. "Duchess," he said, with a slight bow that felt more mocking than respectful, I confess I did not expect Julian to actually go through with it. Go through with what exactly? The whole arrangement. He gestured vaguely, as though the specifics were beneath discussing directly. I assumed after our conversation he would find some quieter way to fulfill the inheritance requirement without such a public commitment. Your conversation about the wager, you mean? Something flickered across Henry's face, quick calculation replacing his easy smile. Ah, he told you about that, did he? I would have expected him to keep such details private. He did not tell me. I overheard it at Lady Vane's gathering, from women who apparently knew far more about my own marriage than I did. Henry's expression shifted again, something almost like genuine surprise crossing his features. Then allow me to clarify, since it seems Julian's version reached you incomplete. I proposed the wager as something of a joke, admittedly a poor one. Julian refused outright, quite forcefully actually, and told me in no uncertain terms that he found the entire suggestion beneath contempt. He chose you, Duchess, for reasons that had nothing to do with any wager of mine, whatever those reasons might have been. Evelina's certainty, so carefully constructed over the past month, began to waver. Why would he not simply tell me this himself? Henry shrugged, swirling the wine in his glass. You would need to ask him that. Though if I know my cousin at all, and I believe I do, I suspect he assumed you already thought the worst of him and saw little point in defending himself against an accusation you seemed determined to believe. The words settled into her chest with uncomfortable weight. She thought of the weeks of silence between them, the way she had shut every door before he had the chance to explain, the way she had interpreted his restraint as guilt, rather than considering it might simply be the same difficulty with vulnerable conversation she had already noticed in him weeks earlier, the same difficulty that led him to leave kindness in anonymous gestures rather than risk speaking it aloud. She excused herself from Henry's company shortly after, her mind spinning with a confusion she had not expected to feel. She had built an entire narrative around Julian's silence, certain it confirmed the worst version of events, and now found herself wondering if she had simply misread a man who did not know how to fight for something in the way she had expected him to fight. She found him later that evening, standing near the edge of the gathering, half hidden in shadow, watching the room with the same guarded expression he wore at every social event they attended together. She approached before she could talk herself out of it. Henry told me about the wager, she said. His version, at least, that you refused it. Julian's expression tightened, wariness immediately replacing whatever softness had briefly shown at her approach. And do you believe him? I do not know what I believe anymore. That seems to be the pattern of things between us lately. The bitterness in his voice surprised her, quiet but unmistakable, the first real crack she had seen in his careful composure since the night of Lady Vane's gathering. She opened her mouth to respond, uncertain what she even intended to say, but before she could speak further, a commotion erupted near the entrance of the room, servants rushing past with alarmed expressions, someone calling for the Duke's immediate attention. A messenger had arrived, breathless and pale, bearing news that would pull both their attentions entirely away from the conversation they had only just begun. Fire, the messenger said, breaking through his own panic. Fire in the tenant cottages on the eastern edge of the Ashcombe estate, spreading fast in the dry winter wind, families trapped with nowhere to go. Julian's face drained of color. Without another word to Evelina, without any further discussion of wagers or silence or the weeks of careful distance between them, he turned and moved through the crowd with sudden urgency, calling for his carriage, calling for anyone willing to help. Evelina, without pausing to think it through, followed him. The road to the eastern cottages was thick with smoke long before the carriage arrived, an orange glow lighting the night sky in a way that made Evelina's chest tighten with dread. Julian was out of the carriage before it fully stopped, shouting instructions to the men already gathered near the water pumps, his careful composure entirely gone, replaced by something raw, and urgent that Evelina had never seen from him before. She climbed down after him, her fine gown catching on the carriage step, forgotten the moment her feet touched the ground. The heat from the fire reached her even at a distance, and the sound of it, a low roaring crackle punctuated by shouts and the frightened cries of children, sent every instinct in her body toward action rather than fear. "Evelina, stay back," Julian called, already moving toward the nearest cottage where a young family stood huddled outside, the mother clutching an infant while the father tried to organize a line of buckets from the well. "I can help," she said, already moving past him toward the family. "I am not made of glass, Julian." She did not wait for his response. She reached the mother first, a woman perhaps her own age, her face streaked with soot and tears, and immediately began helping to calm the older children who clung to her skirts, terrified by the noise and chaos around them. "Is everyone out?" Evelina asked, keeping her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. "My mother," the woman said, her voice breaking. "She would not leave. She is still inside. She went back for something, I do not know what, and the smoke, I cannot go back in there with the children." Evelina did not think. She simply moved, pulling her shawl up over her mouth and nose, heading toward the cottage door before anyone could stop her. Behind her, she heard Julian shout her name, heard the panic in his voice, but she had already crossed the threshold into the smoke-filled darkness inside. The heat hit her first, thick and suffocating, followed immediately by smoke so dense she could barely see her own hands in front of her face. She called out, her voice muffled through the shawl, straining to hear any response over the roar of flames somewhere near the back of the small structure. A weak voice answered from a corner of the room. An elderly woman crouched near an old wooden chest, coughing violently, clearly disoriented by the smoke. "My husband's things," the old woman gasped, clutching at the chest. "I cannot leave them." "You must leave them now," Evelina said, pulling the woman up by her arm with a strength she did not know she possessed. "Please, we have to go now." The old woman resisted for a moment longer, then seemed to understand the urgency in Evelina's voice, allowing herself to be guided back toward the door. They had made it only halfway across the room when a beam somewhere above them cracked loudly, sending a shower of sparks down near the doorway, and for one terrifying moment, Evelina could not see any clear path forward. Then hands were on her, strong and certain, pulling both women toward the door with a force that left no room for hesitation. Julian had followed her in, his own shawl wrapped around his face, and together they half carried the old woman out into the cold night air, collapsing onto the frozen ground just as another section of the cottage roof gave way behind them. Evelina coughed violently, her lungs burning, but she was alive, and the old woman was alive, and the terror of the past few minutes began to drain away, replaced by exhausted relief. Julian knelt beside her, his hands framing her face with an urgency that had nothing careful or restrained about it. "Are you hurt? Evelina, look at me, are you hurt?" "I am well," she managed between coughs. "I am well, Julian." Something broke open in his expression then, relief so raw it looked almost like pain. "You could have died in there. Why would you do something so reckless?" "The same reason you followed me in," she said, "because leaving her was not an option." He did not respond to that, only pulled her against his chest with an intensity that surprised them both, holding her there while the fire continued to rage behind them, while other men worked to contain the flames before they could spread further, while the cold night air slowly cleared the smoke from her lungs. They stayed at the site for hours, helping coordinate blankets and shelter for the displaced families, working alongside servants and tenants alike until the last embers had been contained and the immediate danger had passed. By the time they finally returned to Ashcombe Hall, exhaustion had settled over both of them so completely that conversation felt impossible. But something had shifted between them in those hours, something neither of them fully acknowledged yet, though both felt it clearly enough in the quiet way they moved together, checking on each other without words, offering small, steadying touches that had nothing careful or distant about them. It was nearly dawn by the time they sat together in the small morning room, too exhausted for sleep, nursing cups of tea that had gone cold hours ago. Evelina studied Julian across the table, taking in the soot still smudged along his jaw, the exhaustion evident in every line of his posture, and felt something crack open inside her chest that had been sealed shut since the night of Lady Vane's gathering. "Tell me about the portrait," she said quietly, "the one in the east wing." Julian's hand tightened slightly around his teacup, but he did not deflect the question this time, did not retreat into careful formality as he had every time the subject arose before. "Charlotte was my younger sister," he said. "We lost her 3 years ago, a fever that took her within a week, faster than anyone expected." He paused, his voice roughening slightly. "I have not been able to move her portrait to the main gallery. Every time I try, I find myself unable to look at it directly, so it remains where it is, half hidden, where I can visit it when I am ready without the whole household watching me do so." "I am so sorry, Julian. She was the only person in my family who ever spoke to me plainly," he continued, something almost wondering in his tone, as though he had not planned to say any of this aloud. "Everyone else in my life speaks in careful arrangements and practical necessities. Charlotte simply said what she meant. I have missed that terribly since she has been gone." Evelina thought of the anonymous kindnesses, the books and flowers left without explanation, the careful distance he maintained even while clearly caring for her comfort. She understood suddenly, with a clarity that had eluded her for weeks, that this was a man who had learned, through whatever grief and loss shaped him, that speaking plainly about his feelings invited pain. He did not know how to survive twice. "And the wager," she said. "Tell me plainly, Julian, not through Henry, not through gossip overheard at a party. Tell me yourself." He set down his teacup, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since they had returned from the fire. "Henry proposed it as a joke, the kind of careless thing he says after too much wine at his club. I refused immediately, told him it was beneath both of us, and I meant every word of it. When Whitfield began the search for a suitable bride, my only instruction was that she be someone of quiet, steady character, someone who valued substance over spectacle." He paused, something vulnerable entering his expression. "I did not choose you for your plainness, Evelina. I chose you because everything Whitfield described about your character, your care for your father, your quiet strength through difficult circumstances, told me you were exactly the kind of person I hoped to find. The rest, the words about attracting attention, that was Whitfield's clumsy attempt to summarize something he never fully understood himself. Why did you not tell me any of this weeks ago, when I first confronted you?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as though searching for words that did not come easily. "Because you had already decided what to believe," he said finally, "and some part of me believed you were right to doubt me. I have never been good at proving myself worthy of anyone's trust through words alone. I thought, foolishly perhaps, that if I simply continued treating you with the care I felt, you would eventually see the truth without needing me to argue for it. That is a difficult way to live, Julian. Waiting for someone to simply understand you without ever explaining yourself." "I am aware of that now," he said quietly, "more aware than I have been in a very long time." Evelina reached across the table, her hand covering his, feeling the tension in his fingers slowly ease beneath her touch. "I built a wall between us based on gossip and assumption," she said. "I should have come to you directly, should have given you the chance to explain before I decided the worst version of events was the true one. I am sorry for that, Julian. We are both guilty of the same failing, it seems, retreating into silence rather than risking the discomfort of honest conversation." They sat together as the first light of dawn began creeping through the windows, neither speaking further, but something had settled between them that felt entirely different from the careful distance of the past weeks. Not resolution, exactly. The weeks of hurt and misunderstanding could not simply dissolve in a single conversation after a single night of shared crisis. But something had cracked open between them, a door that had been sealed shut now standing ajar, and both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever came next would require more honesty than either of them had yet offered the other. The following days brought a different kind of quiet to Ashcombe Hall, not the cold, careful silence of before, but something gentler, tentative, as though both of them were relearning how to exist together after everything that had been said and left unsaid between them. Julian joined her for breakfast again, and their conversations, while still careful, no longer carried the same guarded distance. Evelina found herself watching him with new understanding, seeing past the careful composure to the grief and difficulty that shaped it. But understanding, she was beginning to realize, was not the same as resolution. There remained a conversation neither of them had yet had, the deeper reckoning of what they wanted from this marriage, beyond mutual understanding of past hurts, and Evelina sensed that reckoning approaching with each day that passed, each small moment of renewed closeness between them building towards something neither of them could avoid much longer. 2 weeks after the fire, Lady Vane hosted another gathering, this time to celebrate the successful rebuilding efforts on the Ashcombe estate, a cause that had become something of a fashionable charity among London's wealthier families, once word spread of the Duchess's own involvement in rescuing tenants from the flames. Evelina had not expected to become a subject of admiration rather than pity, but the shift in how society regarded her since that night had been undeniable. Whispered conversations replaced now with genuine curiosity about the woman who had run into a burning building, without hesitation. She found the attention almost as uncomfortable as the earlier gossip had been, though for entirely different reasons. She had not acted that night to earn admiration. She had acted because the alternative, standing by while someone suffered, had simply never occurred to her as an option. Julian found her standing near a window partway through the evening, having extracted herself from yet another conversation about her bravery that made her skin itch with discomfort. "You look as though you would rather be anywhere else," he observed, a hint of dry amusement in his voice that she had come to recognize as uniquely his own. "I would rather people stopped treating me as though I performed some remarkable feat. I simply did what needed doing." That is precisely what makes it remarkable, Evelina. Most people faced with that choice hesitate. You did not. She turned to study him, nodding the way candlelight caught the careful composure he still wore like armor even now. Weeks after their conversation in the morning room had cracked something open between them. "May we speak privately?" she asked. "Not here, somewhere quieter." He nodded, and together they slipped away from the gathering into a small adjoining study, empty except for the low crackle of a fire in the hearth and the muffled sound of conversation drifting from the room beyond. "I have been thinking," Evelina began, once the door was closed behind them, "about what you said the morning after the fire, about learning to prove yourself through actions rather than words, waiting for people to simply understand without needing explanation. I remember. I understand why you learned that habit, Julian. Losing Charlotte the way you did, learning that even the people you love most can be taken suddenly, without warning. I imagine that makes speaking plainly about your feelings feel dangerous, as though numbing something aloud might somehow make its loss more possible." Julian's expression flickered, surprise mixing with something rawer beneath it. "You see quite a lot for someone I have known such a short time. I have had ample opportunity to study you, Julian, given how little else you have offered me by way of direct explanation." A faint smile touched his mouth, though it did not fully banish the wariness in his eyes. "Fair enough. But I cannot live the rest of my life interpreting anonymous kindnesses and careful silences as evidence of feelings you refuse to name," she continued, steadying herself for the conversation she had been building toward for days now. "I do not need grand declarations, Julian. I am not asking for poetry or performance, but I need honesty. I need you to tell me plainly what you want from this marriage, from me, rather than leaving me to guess at your intentions through books left on nightstands and flowers replaced in vases." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder, and Evelina wondered if she had pushed too hard, too fast, if he would retreat once again into the careful distance that had defined so much of their early marriage. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the careful reserve she had grown accustomed to. "I did not expect to feel anything for you," he said slowly, as though each word cost him something significant to produce. "I entered this marriage believing it would remain exactly what it was designed to be, a practical arrangement, nothing more. I told myself I would keep enough distance to protect us both from the kind of disappointment that comes from expecting more than an arrangement like ours was built to provide. And now, I find that distance has become impossible to maintain." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the uncertainty in his expression, so different from the composed man she had married weeks earlier. "I think of you constantly, Evelina, in ways that have nothing to do with practical arrangements or inheritance requirements. I find myself choosing books I think you might enjoy, not because I feel obligated to some anonymous gesture, but because I genuinely want to see your face light up when you discover something new. I watched you run into a burning building without a second thought for your own safety, and I have never in my life felt fear like that, because somewhere in these past weeks, without ever intending to, I have come to care for you far more deeply than I ever expected to care for anyone again after losing Charlotte." Evelina's breath caught. "Julian, I'm not skilled at saying such things plainly," he continued, something almost desperate entering his voice now, as though having finally opened this door, he could not stop the words from pouring through it. "I have spent 3 years teaching myself that numbing what I feel only makes its loss more painful when it inevitably comes. But you asked for honesty, and I find I would rather risk that pain than continue watching you doubt whether you matter to me at all." "I do not doubt it any longer," she said softly. "I think I have not doubted it for some time now, Julian. I simply needed to hear you say it." "Then hear this as well," he said, closing the remaining distance between them, his hand rising to cup her cheek with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "Whatever this marriage began as, a practical arrangement between strangers, a solution to problems that had nothing to do with either of us as individuals, I do not wish for it to remain that any longer. I want to build something real with you, Evelina, something honest. I cannot promise I will always find the words easily, but I can promise I will keep trying, rather than retreating into silence the way I have done for far too long." Evelina felt something warm and certain settle into place inside her chest, replacing the careful guardedness she had carried since her father's study weeks ago, since the moment Mr. Whitfield had first described her as a woman who would not attract attention. "I want that as well," she said. "I want us to choose each other, not because circumstance forced our hands, but because we genuinely wish to build a life together." Julian's expression softened into something she had never seen from him before, unguarded and honest in a way that made her realize how carefully he had kept himself hidden even in their most tender moments together, until now. "Then let us choose it," he said quietly, "properly this time. Not because an inheritance required it, not because our families needed it, but because we want it for ourselves." He kissed her then, gently, nothing like the brief formal gesture from their wedding day weeks earlier. This kiss carried weight and intention, a promise rather than an obligation, and Evelina found herself leaning into it with a certainty that surprised her, given how uncertain everything about this marriage had felt only weeks before. When they finally returned to the gathering, something had visibly shifted between them, a warmth in how Julian kept his hand at her back, a lightness in Evelina's expression that had not been there when they arrived. Lady Vane, watching from across the room with the same sharp attention she seemed to apply to everyone in her orbit, raised an eyebrow but said nothing, though Evelina caught the faintest hint of approval in her expression as they passed. The following months brought changes to Ashcombe Hall that surprised even the household staff who had served the family for years. Dinners that had once passed in careful, polite silence now filled with genuine conversation, laughter occasionally drifting from the dining room in a way that made Mrs. Fenwick smile quietly to herself as she oversaw the evening service. The portrait of Charlotte finally found its way to the main gallery, moved there by Julian himself one afternoon, Evelina standing quietly beside him as he spoke, haltingly but honestly, about the sister he had lost, allowing himself to grieve openly for the first time since her death. Evelina wrote to her father regularly, sharing details of her new life that had shifted so dramatically from the anxious uncertainty of those early weeks. Her father visited that spring, and watching him interact with Julian, seeing the easy respect that had grown between the two men who had once negotiated her future across a desk covered in legal documents, Evelina felt a peace settle over her that she had not expected to find in a marriage that began as nothing more than practical necessity. She thought often, in quiet moments, of the woman she had been in her father's study that cold morning, bracing herself for a life of polite distance and careful arrangement, expecting nothing beyond survival from a marriage built on necessity rather than choice. She had not expected to find, buried beneath careful silences and anonymous kindnesses, a man capable of the kind of honest, steady love that asked nothing of her except her genuine presence in his life. Their marriage remained, in many ways, unlike the grand romantic stories society liked to tell about love matches and whirlwind courtships. It had begun in a lawyer's careful language, in practical necessity and financial desperation, in a description of her as plain and unremarkable that had wounded her deeply before she understood the man who would eventually prove those words meaningless. But standing together now in the gardens of Ashcombe Hall on a warm spring evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, Julian's hand steady in hers, Evelina understood that the beginning of a story mattered far less than what two people chose to build from it afterward. They had been given an arrangement. Together, slowly and honestly, they had turned it into something neither of them had dared to hope for. A marriage chosen freely, built on truth rather than convenience, strong enough now to weather whatever silences or misunderstandings might still arise between them in the years ahead. Whatever London society had once whispered about the Duke's plainest bride, none of it mattered any longer to either of them. They had found in each other something far more valuable than appearance or reputation ever could have offered. They had found honesty. They had found partnership. They had found, against every expectation either of them carried into that cold December morning weeks earlier, something that felt remarkably, unmistakably, like love.